On K2, heroism doesn't announce itself with flags or applause. It appears quietly, often too late, and sometimes it looks exactly like walking away. High on the mountain above, 26,000 feet, the rules people bring from home begin to fail. Oxygen thins until every decision feels borrowed. Time stretches, judgment narrows, and the promise most climbers carry into the Karakoram, no one left behind, collides with a harder truth no one likes to say out loud. At that altitude, stopping can mean dying. This story begins where certainty ends. In the death zone, rescue is not a plan, it's a hope. There are no helicopters hovering on standby, no stretchers, no margin for error. Every step costs strength you may never get back. And when someone collapses, when frostbite locks joints, when the lungs flood, when the mind drifts, the question isn't what is right, it's what is possible. Teams arrive bonded by shared risk, relying heavily on Sherpa climbers whose strength, experience, and quiet endurance make these ascents feasible at all. But the higher they go, the more the mountain forces are reckoning. Survival becomes individual. Choices become irreversible. What follows is not an indictment, nor a defense. It's an examination of the unwritten code that governs K2 when ideals meet physics, when compassion strains against biology, and the cost of staying may be your own life. This is K2 Stories, where we don't chase summits, but the truth behind them. K2 does not ease climbers into its reality. It confronts them early, then strips away illusions one layer at a time. By the time a team pushes above 8,000 meters, they've already learned the first lesson the mountain enforces, without apology. The death zone is not a place for recovery. It is a place where the body is actively failing. At these heights, oxygen saturation drops so low that the human body begins to shut itself down. Muscles weaken. Thinking slows. Simple tasks, clipping a carabiner, adjusting a mask, require full concentration. Sleep no longer restores. Hunger disappears. And any injury, no matter how small, compounds rapidly. This is where rescue, as people imagine it, ceases to exist. There are no helicopters capable of sustained flight at this altitude. Even if weather clears, and on K2, it rarely does. Rotor lift simply fails in the thin air. Carrying another person becomes nearly impossible. A single climber already struggles under their own weight, oxygen system, and frost-numbed limbs. Adding a second body is not heroic, it is lethal. Veteran climbers understand this before they arrive, but understanding something intellectually is very different from facing it when the person lying in the snow is someone you trained with, laughed with, trusted your life to. In 2008, that reckoning unfolded in real time during one of the deadliest days in K2's history. Climbers from multiple teams became trapped high on the mountain after a massive ice collapse destroyed fixed ropes. Among them was Dutch climber Wilco van Ruijen and Norwegian alpinist Cicely Skog. Nearby, South Korean climber Sungtae Park was struggling to descend, exhausted and disoriented. Multiple climbers encountered Park during their own desperate descent. Some stopped briefly, some spoke to him, some tried to assess whether he could move, but no coordinated rescue was possible. Everyone was operating at the edge of collapse. Oxygen was running out. Darkness was coming. Staying meant joining him. Park did not survive. In the years that followed, survivors carried the weight of that moment, not just grief, but judgment. From the outside, the question seemed simple. How could they leave him? From the inside, it was anything but. Climbers later described a state where decision-making felt mechanical, stripped down to a single calculation: move or die. Sherpa climbers were there too, often moving repeatedly through dangerous sections to assist multiple teams. Their role in such moments is frequently understated. While Western climbers are fighting to keep themselves alive, Sherpas are often expected implicitly or explicitly to do more. Fix lines, guide, assess others, sometimes at immense personal risk. The moral burden does not fall evenly. Another name often spoken quietly in these discussions is Ger McDonough, an Irish climber who died during the same 2008 disaster while attempting to help others descend. His actions are remembered as heroic, but they also underline the mountain's indifference. Good intentions do not change outcomes on K2. These incidents are not failures of character. They are collisions between human values and an environment that does not accommodate them. On K2, the shift from solidarity to self-preservation happens gradually, then all at once. A climber realizes their hands no longer function properly, that their oxygen gauge is lower than expected, that stopping even for a few minutes causes violent shivering or creeping confusion. The body sends a clear message: you do not have time. What makes these moments especially haunting is that they rarely involve panic. They are quiet, calm, a few words exchanged through masks. A look, then someone turns downhill. Later, safely home, the questions arrive. Could I have done more? Should I have stayed longer? Why am I alive when they are not? K2 offers no answers. It only reveals how thin the line is between ideals we cherish and the limits we cannot escape. And as the mountain has shown again and again, the higher you go, the fewer choices remain. If the death zone is where the body fails, it is also where the mind begins to betray itself. At extreme altitude, climbers are no longer making decisions with a clear, rested brain. Hypoxia alters perception, time compresses or stretches unpredictably, emotions flatten. What feels like calm reasoning may actually be cognitive shutdown. Veteran high-altitude doctors have described it bluntly. Above 8,000 meters, you are not thinking, you are functioning on instinct and habit. This matters, because the decision to stop for someone else is not just moral, it is neurological. One of the clearest examples came in 1986. During K2's infamous Black Summer, 13 climbers died in a single season, many after being trapped high on the mountain by prolonged storms. Among them was British climber Julie Tullis, who became severely ill during the descent. Her teammates faced a familiar equation: delay and risk being caught by worsening weather, or move fast and survive. Accounts from that expedition describe climbers sitting only meters apart, too exhausted to help one another, each person trapped inside their own failing body. There was no dramatic abandonment, only paralysis, confusion, and the slow realization that no one had the strength left to save anyone else. What is often missed in retellings is how Sherpa climbers experience these moments differently, and yet are judged by the same impossible standard. Sherpas frequently carry heavier loads, make multiple trips through hazardous terrain, and operate with less margin than their clients. When a climber collapses, Sherpas are often the first to reach them, and the last to leave. In 2014, during a tragic avalanche on Everest that killed 16 Sherpa climbers, the global climbing community was forced to confront a long-ignored imbalance, whose lives are expected to be risked, and whose decisions are later scrutinized. While that tragedy occurred on Everest, the ethical framework extends directly to K2, where Sherpas face even more extreme conditions with fewer safety nets. On K2, Sherpas have been involved in some of the most extraordinary high-altitude rescues ever attempted, often at great personal cost, but they are also bound by the same biological limits as everyone else. When oxygen runs low, when storms close in, when strength vanishes, Sherpas face the same final question: if I stay, will anyone survive? Veteran climber and writer Ed Viesturs has repeatedly emphasized this reality, stating that above 8,000 meters, rescue is largely a myth. Not because climbers don't care, but because caring does not create oxygen, strength, or time. This is where public perception often diverges sharply from lived experience. From a distance, abandonment sounds like a moral failure. Up close, it feels like triage with no tools. Climbers must constantly assess not just whether someone is alive, but whether helping them will kill everyone involved. Even identifying whether someone can still move becomes difficult. Frostbitten climbers may appear conscious, but lack the coordination to stand. Others insist they can continue until they collapse again moments later. Language barriers, oxygen masks, and cognitive impairment compound the confusion. In these moments, climbers rely on rules they never wanted to learn. If a person cannot stand on their own, if they cannot clip themselves into a rope, if they cannot respond coherently, these are not judgments about worth, they are assessments of survivability. And yet, knowing the rule does not silence the doubt. Survivors often describe a haunting delay, the moment they take a step downward, then stop, wondering if they should turn back. That pause, sometimes lasting only seconds, can define the rest of their lives. Years later, many of them stop climbing altogether, not because they are afraid of the mountain, but because they cannot reconcile what the mountain forced them to do. K2 does not reward courage. It does not punish cruelty. It simply exposes how fragile human ethics become when stripped of oxygen, warmth, and time. And as the climbers descend, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The mountain doesn't demand abandonment. It makes rescue impossible and leaves humans to live with what remains. Every K2 tragedy leaves behind two titans. One ends on the mountain, the other continues quietly, relentlessly inside the people who walked away. Survivors rarely speak about these moments in absolutes. Instead, they describe fragments. A face half covered in ice. A voice that sounded calm but wasn't making sense. A glance at an oxygen gauge, lower than it should have been. Then the realization that staying just a little longer would mean never leaving at all. In 1995, legendary British climber Alison Hargreaves died near the summit of K2 after being caught in a sudden storm. Several climbers were on the mountain at the same time, themselves exhausted and deteriorating. Later discussions circled around the same painful question. Could anyone have reached her? Those who were there largely agree on the answer. By the time conditions collapsed, there was no capacity left for rescue, for heroics, or even for clear thought. The aftermath of such decisions is rarely public. There are no official hearings, no verdicts, only private reckonings. Climbers who survive often carry a deep, unresolved guilt, not because they believe they made the wrong choice, but because they were forced to choose at all. Psychologists who work with high-altitude survivors describe a pattern similar to moral injury, a wound caused not by fear, but by acting against one's own values under impossible circumstances. Sherpa climbers experience this weight in a different, often heavier way. They are expected to be resilient, composed, and endlessly capable. When a client dies, Sherpas may face quiet blame, even when no realistic intervention existed. And unlike many Western climbers, they often return to the mountains season after season, not to chase personal dreams, but to support families and communities far below. In 2021, when Nepali climbers achieved the first winter ascent of K2, the world celebrated their strength and unity. What received far less attention was the ethical clarity they articulated afterward, that no summit is worth a life, and no climber is expendable. Yet even they acknowledged a hard truth: winter or summer, above 8,000 meters, that principle has limits enforced by nature itself. Within the climbing community, these incidents are discussed carefully, often without names, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. Most climbers understand that judging a decision made in hypoxia, cold, and exhaustion from the safety of sea level is not analysis, it's illusion. Still, the questions linger. Did the group dynamics push someone too far? Did summit pressure cloud judgment earlier in the day? Could turning around sooner have changed everything? Sometimes the answer is yes. Often, it isn't. K2 is particularly unforgiving because it offers so few escape routes. Weather windows are narrow, descents are technically demanding, and help, even when nearby, may be just as compromised as the person who needs it. What remains after the mountain releases its survivors is a silence filled with second-guessing. Some climbers try to justify their actions logically, replaying the physics and physiology. Others avoid the topic entirely. A few speak openly, not to absolve themselves, but to ensure that the public understands the cost of romanticizing high-altitude heroism. Over time, many come to the same conclusion. The mountain did not test their morality, it exposed the limits of it. K2 does not allow clean narratives. There are no villains, no simple heroes, only people operating at the edge of human capacity, making decisions that would never be acceptable anywhere else and hoping never to face them again. And yet, despite everything, climbers keep returning. Not because they forget what happened, but because K2 represents something brutally honest, a place where intention is irrelevant, and survival depends on knowing when even compassion must yield to reality. The scars left behind are invisible, but they endure long after the summit photos fade, long after the headlines move on. And for those who lived through it, the mountain never truly lets go. As the years pass, the climbing world keeps trying to make sense of what K2 refuses to explain. Technology improves. Weather forecasts become more precise, oxygen systems grow lighter and more efficient. Communication is clearer than it has ever been. And yet, when climbers cross into the death zone, the fundamental equation remains unchanged. Human limits do not scale with innovation. Many believe that better gear should eliminate the need for impossible choices. History suggests otherwise. In 2018, Polish climber Tomek Mackiewicz became critically ill during a winter attempt on Nana Parbat, another 8,000-meter peak notorious for its brutality. His partner, Elizabeth Revel, managed to descend far enough to be rescued, but Mackiewicz was left behind, beyond reach. An international rescue team, including elite climbers and Sherpas, risked their lives attempting to reach him. They came close, but they could not save him. The rescue was widely praised and still, it failed. That incident echoed a truth K2 has been teaching for decades. Even extraordinary effort has a ceiling. At some point, physics wins, so does physiology, and no amount of courage can renegotiate that contract. On K2 itself, climbers have increasingly questioned not just what decisions are made, but when. Many tragedies trace back to earlier moments continuing upward too late in the day, pushing despite worsening weather, ignoring subtle signs of exhaustion. By the time abandonment becomes an issue, the real failure may already be hours behind them. This has shifted the ethical conversation. Instead of focusing solely on the moment someone is left behind, experienced climbers now emphasize prevention, conservative turnaround times, stricter summit discipline, and clearer agreements within teams, including with Sherpa partners about when a climb ends. Sherpa climbers, in particular, have begun asserting stronger boundaries. After decades of carrying disproportionate risk, many now refuse to push in unsafe conditions, regardless of client pressure. This evolution is not a rejection of solidarity, it is a redefinition of it. Protecting life sometimes means refusing to gamble with it. Still, even with perfect planning, K2 leaves no guarantees. Storms form faster than forecasts predict. Avalanches trigger without warning. A minor stumble can become catastrophic. And when something goes wrong high on the mountain, climbers may still find themselves facing the same unbearable choice: stay and die together, or leave and live alone with the memory. What unsettles many survivors most is how ordinary the moment feels. There is rarely a dramatic declaration. No final speech, just exhaustion, cold, and the quiet understanding that the situation has crossed a line. Later, back home, the world often wants certainty. Headlines demand heroes or villains. Comment sections fill with moral verdicts. But those who have been there know how hollow that framing is. The mountain does not ask whether you are brave. It does not care how much you love your teammate or how strong your principles are. It only asks one question: can your body continue? If the answer is no, the rest becomes irrelevant. Some climbers carry this knowledge into advocacy, speaking openly about limits and responsibility. Others retreat into silence, unwilling or unable to relive the moment. Both responses are understandable. Neither erases what happened. What K2 ultimately forces into view is something deeply uncomfortable: that human compassion, though powerful, is not infinite. It operates within biological constraints. And when those constraints are exceeded, morality does not disappear, but it fractures. In that fracture, people do not become monsters. They become human. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all, that in the death zone, survival itself can feel like a betrayal, even when it is the only outcome left. The mountain remains unmoved by this conflict. It stands exactly where it always has, waiting not for the next summit, but for the next reckoning. K2 does not teach courage the way stories often promise. It teaches restraint, it teaches timing, and more than anything, it teaches the cost of ignoring limits that cannot be negotiated. In the death zone, there are no clean victories. Every outcome is partial. Those who die lose everything. Those who live carry something they never asked for: the memory of a moment when compassion collided with survival, and survival won. It's tempting to believe there is a right answer hiding somewhere in these stories, a perfect decision, a heroic alternative. But K2 exposes a harder truth. Above a certain altitude, ethics are no longer about choosing good over evil. They are about choosing the least irreversible loss. The climbers who turn downhill while someone else remains behind do not forget that choice. It shapes how they see risk, responsibility, and themselves. Many never return to the high mountains. Some do, but with a different definition of success. Sherpa climbers, whose resilience makes these expeditions possible, understand this reality perhaps better than anyone. They know that strength is not proven by how much you can endure, but by recognizing when endurance becomes sacrifice without purpose. K2 reminds us that survival is not selfish. It is biological, it is finite, and it demands honesty long before the summit is in reach. There is a saying often repeated in high-altitude climbing: on Everest, reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. K2 sharpens that truth even further, because on this mountain, the hardest part isn't turning around. It's living with the knowledge that sometimes, the only way forward is down. If these stories matter to you, if you believe the real lessons of the world's highest mountains are found not at the top, but in the decisions made along the way, this is what K2 Stories exists to explore. Not the myth, not the glory, but the truth that remains, long after the mountain lets you go.